Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. This is What's Cooking with Dr. Cook. I'm Dr. Allison Koch, the resident registered dietitian with foodguides.com. And I'm so excited to present Dr. Alex Cook, who is a certified strength and conditioning specialist and doctor of exercise science with Lenoir Rhyne University, here to talk with us about pre-workout supplements and all of the buzz around them. So thank you for joining us today.
It is my privilege. Love being here. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and hopefully this will be a fun experience and you'll learn a few things. But yeah, I'm very happy to be talking about this topic because it is literally the thing that I'm asked the most about in my profession, which is kind of funny because I teach exercise physiology. I teach a lot of stuff. Been teaching for over 20 years now, but really fairly consistently for the course of my career, the thing that my students most ask me about is pre-workouts. Specifically, hey, Dr. Cook, is this pre-workout good? What do you think about this pre-workout? And I'll be honest with you, like in most cases, because there are so many products out there, it's one that I haven't heard of. So, then I have to whoa, I don't know, but let's look at the ingredients. And then, we have a little more of a discussion because pre-workouts are a very large arm of the supplement industry. They've been around for a while. In my article on Food Guides, I talked about the history of them, and it's actually kind of interesting, at least it is to me. Hopefully it is to the folks listening. But like the first ever pre-workout was out in the 1980s, and it was developed by a guy who was kind of not to speak ill of the dead, but a little bit of a shady figure. And what I mean by that is he's the guy most famous for authoring the Underground Steroid Handbook. That was actually essentially the how-to guide for using steroids and other performance-enhancing stuff. It was back in the 80s, it was mostly steroids. It was like the early 80s, late 70s, I think, when he first published that. It was an underground self-published work, but it was really the go-to reference manual for how to do it. He was a figure from the California bodybuilding scene. I think, if I remember correctly, like in his bio, he was like an art major in college. So he just sort of was self-taught in terms of, he had no formal training in exercise science, nutrition, medicine, chemistry, any of that stuff. He was just a self-taught guy. His original product that he developed later, and this was after, I think Ultimate Orange hit the market like mid 80s, maybe early 80s. I forget exactly. I put it in the article. But he'd already established his fame and his record as being the steroid guy. And I think that was part of the marketing appeal for his first product, Ultimate Orange. It was kind of like, a little bit edgy, a little bit dangerous, so to speak, because it was a product that had been developed. It was linked to this guy who was a fairly notorious figure. I think he did a stint in prison for dealing steroids back in the day, and it was a legitimate product at the time, nothing illegal in it, but it contained sugar, no big deal. It contained ephedrine, and it contained amino acids. And ephedrine was a stimulant, is still a stimulant. Ephedrine now is banned by the FDA. And that was kind of like the first, sort of mark in history of something in pre-workouts that later gets banned by the FDA. And that's kind of the common thing, is that, that was the original OG pre-workout, Ultimate Orange in the 80s. Now there's so many pre-workouts out there by so many different companies. It's a really popular supplement, and many teenagers, college age kids are taking them quite regularly up through all ages are imbibing pre-workouts for a variety of reasons. There are so many different manufacturers. The trick is there's a fairly common theme of ingredients that are in pre-workouts because they all are sort of intending to achieve the same effect, which is to get people ready to work hard, hopefully improve exercise performance. But in my article, I kind of broke it down. I try to be a little bit clever the way I posted it, but essentially in pre-workouts, typically you have stuff to wake you up, stuff to pump you up, and then I said other stuff that kind of doesn't make sense, but might actually be effective in some instances. But the stuff to wake you up first is just stimulants. That's always in pre-workouts, essentially some form of a stimulant. The original Ultimate Orange had ephedrine in it. Ephedrine is banned by the FDA now for good reason, because in the history of ephedrine use, it used to be a very popular over-the-counter supplement. It was in a lot of like diet aids as well as pre-workouts, but it did get linked to some sudden deaths during exercise in young folks, and that's unfortunately a common theme with the worst instances of pre-workout use and abuse, is that because it is a dietary supplement and you can just buy it at GNC or Walmart even, people kind of think it is harmless, but any substance can be misused. You can overdose on anything, and ephedrine was relatively easy to overdose on, so it was linked to some early deaths. And that was, I think, early 2000s, maybe around 2003, 2004. Ephedrine was yanked from supplements in the FDA by the FDA, excuse me. Though if you look in the shadier corners on the internet, you can still get it. But ephedrine was a stimulant. Caffeine is a stimulant that's in many pre-workouts. Caffeine, again, something that we commonly imbibe in a lot of stuff: coffee, tea, chocolate, you name it. Caffeine, again, because it's so omnipresent, we don't typically think of it as dangerous. But again, as with anything, it can be abused. If you take too high a dose of caffeine, you can suffer ill effects, including sudden death. Essentially, it can cause heart attacks, and it has. That's not something that's easy to do in most forms in which you imbibe the supplement, but it is possible. One specific example that I can recall having experience with is when I was in graduate school. We had one of our fellow graduate students was doing a project studying the effects of caffeine on exercise. And again, there's a lot of documentation. Now, this was 30 years ago. A lot of documentation showing very effective use of caffeine when properly dosed for people exercising. It helps with all form of exercise, but it's still a drug. It still can be harmful in high doses. And in this specific instance, I'm recalling the student very properly was doing a double-blind research project, which is a good way to do research. That means you have subjects who don't know what they're getting, if they're getting a real supplement or if they're getting placebo, and you don't know yourself as the researcher, because that can bias your expectation of results. So the student was being smart. He had one of the professors in the department mixing his experimental supplement for him. So half the time the subjects were going to get placebo, half the time they would get caffeine. But sadly, the professor, he had an absent-minded professor moment. I'm guilty of that. But this was high stakes because he misdosed the caffeine by a factor of 10. He was dealing with caffeine powder. And, sadly, fortunately, nobody died, but a student who was in the study had to be rushed to the hospital because he had so much caffeine, essentially, he was going toxic, and he was on the verge. He was, I think, getting into ventricular fibrillation on his way towards a heart attack, which is a very scary situation. A lot of people don't attribute that sort of danger with caffeine, but as with any substance, it can be dangerous if it is overdosed. I remember you were just showing me, wasn't it a Wales, where young man, he overdosed caffeine, a scoopable caffeine, essentially, and sadly, it was fatal for him. Is that right? It was Wales, wasn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I believe it was Wales. Yeah, he bought like a caffeine powder, so it was concentrated caffeine, and he just didn't do the calculation correctly when he took it, and had essentially what was equivalent to 200 cups of caffeine in one dose, and yeah, it it killed him immediately.
Yeah, and that's horrible and unfortunate to hear about. And that's most pre-workouts. Most millions of people use the things. Very few have issues, but when there are issues, it's usually a case of a bad misdosing, or possibly some hypersensitivity on the part of the subject. Another stimulant, besides caffeine, that's historically been in some pre-workouts is DMAA, dimethylamylamine, I believe, is the drawn out version of it, DMAA, but that was in the original Jack 3D substance, which was a popular, and still is a popular pre-workout, but they had to yank that because the DMAA in it, it basically, it caused some fatalities, and yet another mark in history of pre-workouts potentially being fatal. Again, usually they're not. A lot of people, millions of people use them without problems, but in those rare cases, it can be dangerous enough that it can cause issues. And then that's something I actually have personal experience with as well. I remember very vividly, this was before it was banned, so probably like 2012, I think it was like 2013 or so, the DMAA was yanked from the market. But a fellow I was coaching in his first weightlifting meets, he was taking Jack 3D. It was his first weightlifting meet. He'd never competed before. It was his first time using Jack 3D. He had never taken it before, but his buddy said, "Oh, double scoop it," and he did. I should mention that this guy was about 30 years old. He's quite intelligent. He should have known better, but sometimes we do silly things, and part of that I think is just the perception that if it's a dietary supplement, it's over the counter. It can't be harmful. But man, I'm really glad that he did not have to be hospitalized or anything, but he turned as white as a sheet. He was shaking so bad. I've never seen anybody, like, his legs were just shaking when he was trying to stand over and grab the barbell to like lift off the floor. He couldn't. He literally could not make a lift, which was a sad experience for your first weightlifting meet. After all the hard training, you bomb out if you don't make a lift. And he looked like he was nearly having a cardiac event. It was actually pretty scary. But I'm glad they pulled DMA from the market. Again, I've known some college students who are still getting it because you can find anything you want on the internet, which is unfortunate because it's out there. But those are kind of the more common stimulants. Caffeine is the big one. More recently, I think bitter orange root, citrus aurantium, that is a stimulant that's supposed to be milder and have less risk of cardiac effects, which, yay, that's good, but it's out there. But some form of a stimulant is going to definitely be in your pre-workouts to pump you up, or excuse me, to wake you up. The second part is pumping you up. So increasing blood flow to your muscles. That's one of the main goals of pre-workouts, to give you a better pump during your workout. The chemicals that are in pre-workouts to do that, common ones are arginine and citrulline, both of which are in your body. They can be turned into a substance which you naturally produce called nitric oxide. And nitric oxide does dilate the blood vessels around your tissues, including skeletal muscle. So in theory, if you take more arginine and more citrulline, it should be able to help increase blood flow. The research on it is pretty mixed. So what most studies tend to find is that people taking arginine and citrulline, they can see a noticeable effect if they're kind of at the lower level of training, meaning they're relatively inexperienced. And that's where a lot of research is done. And that's because of sort of convenience. That's where research is. If you want to find people to get in a study, you recruit some college kids. They're around. They're not necessarily, a lot of times the kids who are the higher training status, they're competing in college sports, so they don't really have time to fool with a research study. So you get recreationally trained, regular folks essentially who don't have much of a training background and haven't really adapted to exercise. One of the major adaptations you make to exercise when you do it regularly over months to years, you increase blood flow to muscles because you grow more blood vessels around the muscle that you train habitually, and you get better at dilating them. So it's actually kind of a trained response. So what the studies that have looked at the vasodilators have generally found, in most cases, at least arginine and citrulline mostly seem to work for untrained people. If you've novice to working out, it actually makes a difference. Higher training status, though, if you've been training for a couple of years, it's probably not going to make much in the way of a noticeable difference. So kind of not really helpful, probably, if you're talking about people who are really trying to get an edge in performance in competitive sport and have a good history of training. Other stuff that's in there, nitrates, beetroot, that's in there as well. And again, kind of similarly, should help you produce more nitric oxide, increase blood flow. Nitrates they prescribe as medicine for like relieving chest pain, increasing blood flow to the heart. The levels that are in beetroot juice, probably again, studies I've seen are pretty equivocal. Like some studies find an effect. More likely, it seems to have an effect with people of a lower training status. So not super exciting there. And then the last one in the stuff to pump you up is, in my opinion, the worst one, which is niacin. Niacin is a B vitamin. We all need niacin to live. Actually, you know better than me. What are the, like, if you have a deficiency of niacin, what are the issues?
Well, typically with all B vitamin, deficiencies, it can be confusion. You can have some, skin issues, hair issues. It, it's actually really difficult to have a B vitamin deficiency with the variety of, foods that you can get B vitamins from. And the fact that a lot of our foods are actually enriched with B vitamins. However, there are certain medications that can cause B vitamin deficiencies. Um, but yeah, I mean, it is kind of like, foggy brain, a lot of, skin and hair issues, stuff like that, brittle nails, etc. So,
Cool, because yeah,
yeah.
I am a little bit ignorant of B vitamin deficiency because I've mostly focused on overdose, which that
Which is difficult. I mean, it really is. Because it's a water soluble vitamin. I always would tell like the students that a lot of the times when you drink a Red Bull, for example, and you use the restroom afterwards and you see, yellow urine, that's your B vitamins because you're losing, your B vitamins through your urine that way. You can see it. That's your B12. There it
Yeah,
goes.
yeah, exactly. So it's hard to do, but it is doable because people
It
have done
is.
it. And that's the niacin. I'm not a fan of in pre-workouts, and for a couple of reasons. First reason, there's no evidence that it does anything positive. Niacin has a side effect of it does dilate blood vessels, but seems to target the ones in your skin mostly. It doesn't really have a measurable impact on skeletal muscle blood flow that I've seen in any research. So it makes you feel like something's happening because you will feel a tingling sensation when you take niacin. You feel like, oh, this flushing sensation. So that makes you feel like it's having some meaningful effect, but it's really an illusion, sadly. The only meaningful effect that's been documented in an exercise study with niacin is actually reducing performance. So it actually makes you worse. And that's actually, it's kind of interesting, but it was aerobic exercise trials. And again, this was with untrained subjects like usual, but what they found is that niacin supplement versus pre-workout that contained niacin versus pre-workout no niacin versus placebo, the niacin did worse on the exercise than the placebo, and they speculated that, well, based on their results, it seemed to be that niacin was having some interference effect with your ability to oxidize fat during exercise, because the carbohydrate oxidation versus fat oxidation, which is if you're doing endurance exercise, the more you can oxidize fat, the less you oxidize carbohydrate. Generally, the better you do. But it was worse. They oxidized more carbs, they couldn't oxidize fat as well, and they had a slower time trial. So not really great evidence to take niacin in that regard. Also, as you well know, I took niacin because I had a physician tell me that niacin would help raise my HDL, because there's some evidence that it does, so your good cholesterol can help, but I stopped taking it because there's actually been 2 clinical trials where they actually stopped supplementing people with niacin because so many were having strokes. So I'm not a fan of niacin, I'll be honest. So I would recommend, if you know anybody in your life who takes pre-workouts, or if you're thinking about taking pre-workouts yourself, I would tend to steer clear of the niacin-containing ones. Also, in part because not only does niacin have no evidence that it's actually beneficial for performance, but the dose in pre-workouts is actually pretty high. So in many cases, added to your regular diet, which, as you mentioned, Allison, a lot of supplements or a lot of stuff we eat has extra B vitamins added to it, and we get, if we have a good diet, we have B vitamins in plenitude. So our niacin levels are pretty good. If you add in the doses in pre-workouts, actually a lot of times you push up against tolerable upper limits. And again, it's rare. Many people, take pre-workouts with niacin, get the flush, and that's essentially, in worst cases, I mean, if you've never experienced it before, it can feel like you've been rolled in itching powder. It's not pleasant, but they feel like, oh man, this is really getting me going. But sadly, there are some cases, and there's a few case studies published in literature where people have had liver toxicity because the dose in the niacin that they're taking is so high, and even liver failure, which obviously that's a horrible and fatal condition. So yeah, not and with that risk, as minimal as it might be, added to the fact that there's really not any good evidence that niacin has any measurable benefit, I would recommend, no niacin for me, thank you. So that's the stuff to pump you up. So we got stuff to wake you up, stuff to pump you up. Then we have other stuff that theoretically should help that's in pre-workouts. And that's actually a pretty cool category because there are things in pre-workouts that are linked to performance benefits, and they're not really strongly linked to having any negative effects, or actually no negative, maybe even healthful effects actually. Foremost is creatine. Creatine, it's a protein derivative. You get naturally some creatine from your diet, especially if you eat meat. There's a few vegetable sources of creatine. I remember, like, fun fact, cranberries have like a trace of creatine in them or something like that. But creatine, we all get some creatine in our diet. If you take extra creatine, there's actually some good evidence that it's beneficial. How it works essentially is you store it in your muscles. The more creatine you store in your muscles, there's phosphates, creatine phosphate. It's the immediate fuel for fueling sprints, weightlifting, those types of activities. There's even some benefit to creatine in mitochondrial function, which helps you actually consume oxygen. And I wrote a recent Food Guides article about how creatine actually is helpful for your brain as well. So there's actually good evidence that creatine is healthful in a lot of ways. The trick is that in pre-workouts, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have creatine, because creatine, to get into your muscles and really load up your muscle stores, it takes about a month if you consume like 5 grams of creatine, which is usually like the scooper in it, or about like a heaping teaspoonful of creatine. That's about 5 grams. If you consume 5 grams a day for a month, then you have your muscles loaded. So if you take a shot of creatine, I think like 1 to 3 grams would be what would be in most pre-workouts. Right before you work out, that's not going to help you in 30 minutes or an hour. It's going to help you if you take that every day in a month. So for that reason, creatine is good. It helps you. There's good evidence that it does enhance performance for many conditions. Most strong evidence is in sprint type conditions, repeated sprints and weight training, where you're helping build strength and muscle mass over the long term. But short term with one dose, it's probably not going to do anything for you unless you believe it is, which is placebo.
Right, placebo effect for sure.
It's effective, actually. I did a study with some of my Brazilian friends. That's the belief that they were taking creatine made a huge difference in like reps to failure. And for some folks, it's amazing. Just that power of suggestion. But it is backed up by evidence. It is at least a helpful substance, so there's no evidence that it's harmful to you. The other thing that would fall in that category is beta-alanine. That's also a pretty common substance in pre-workouts. Beta-alanine, how it works is it builds up something in your muscles. The something that beta-alanine helps you build is a substance called carnosine. Carnosine is a buffer. So it essentially, what it works, it's essentially neutralizes the buildup of acidity in your muscles. And as you guys are all probably familiar with, lactic acid is something that you build up when you're exercising hard for, longer sprints or, repeated short sprints. Once you get above like 10 seconds of continuous effort, you're starting to build up a lot of lactate in your muscles. And carnosine will help you avoid fatigue with that. So it'll help you continue running at a faster pace for like a long sprint or middle distance, or it'll help you squeeze out a few more reps if you're doing like 15, 20 reps, that sort of stuff. Or really, I would think combat athletes, like wrestling, boxing, MMA, they would really benefit from carnosine buildup, and beta-alanine is a good supplement for them. However, just like with creatine, you take a shot of beta alanine, it's not going to do anything for you that day. It's something that you have to build up. And I think, if I remember correctly, the build-up time for beta alanine is even longer than creatine. So you're talking at least like a month. My memory is failing me, but it's not going to help you in one dose.
Right.
That it's cool that it's there, but it's not going to help you 30 minutes later. See, also taurine. I should mention that taurine is a popular substance in pre-workouts or energy drinks. That's why, yeah, I think that's where they got the name Red Bull from. It's got the Taurus taurine.
Yeah.
But it's a substance. It's an antioxidant. Has a lot of roles in metabolism and muscle function. Really helps with think like calcium handling in your muscles. But again, that's kind of one where there's some evidence of performance enhancement, especially in untrained folks. But for your more experienced athletes, the evidence really isn't that strong. And there are a lot of things that you can see a measurable effect in with people who are novices don't really seem to work once you get a higher training status. And I think taurine's probably in that category. No evidence that it's probably going to hurt you, but it's not really that beneficial. So the most effective things in pre-workouts would only really be effective if you had a pre-workout once a day for like a month or two. It's beta alanine and creatine. Which and that's kind of the thing with pre-workouts. Do they actually work? Again, it's so diverse in the marketplace in terms of how many substances there are and what they contain. There's no easy answer. There are quite a few published studies that have studied, they typically call them MIPS, multi-ingredient pre-workout supplements, which is a lot easier to say. But there are quite a few well-controlled studies where they find a beneficial effect for pre-workouts in terms of enhancing work performance and, helping increase strength and muscle mass gains, following like a month of training or two. So there are some good studies that show that it can be beneficial, and that's the good thing.
And again, these studies are in, healthy individuals who, are younger or,
Mostly college age, recreationally trained college age males is like if you took that, you could copy and paste that probably to 90% of the studies that are out there because that's the sample of convenience that most universities use. I've been guilty of that myself. That's who's around if you're at universities or where research is done, and that's who's around. It'd be
right.
nice if you could get one of the sports teams to do it for you, but it's very rare. I've seen a few studies on pre-workouts though. There was actually a pretty cool one I was reading where it was elite level boxers, and they did find a benefit. They found essentially caffeine, and I think it might have been caffeine in the bitter orange containing pre-workout. It helped improve focus, and actually they did a fatiguing task, and then it did like an obstacle course style workout. And that was kind of meaningful because they actually were able to do the obstacle course style workout better, had better reaction time, better essentially decision making when they were supplemented versus when they were on the placebo. So there is some evidence in well-trained people for some effects, minor effects. I would posit that a lot of that's coming from caffeine. Caffeine has hundreds of
Very
research
well
articles.
researched. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, it's the most well-studied thing. So,
Hmm.
again, when students ask me about pre-workouts, I usually come back at them with coffee's a lot cheaper. And, my line on pre-workouts, it'll do something for you, but it will do more for you than a cup of coffee will. And in most cases, probably not. And coffee or any dose of caffeine, it is effective. It's highly effective. There are measurable effects for a variety of exercise conditions. It enhances fat oxidation, increases alertness. Even can like there are some studies that show can enhance muscular endurance. Though most studies are focused on the endurance, aerobic endurance, I should say. So long endurance task that has the most documented benefits for. But the dosage is not that. There's no benefit to using an extreme dosage for caffeine. The recommended dosage is 3 to 6 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of your body weight. which, for those of us in the U.S., that's kind of like Greek. But what it usually like for a guy who weighs about 180 pounds like me, essentially that's like 1 to 2 cups of coffee. Essentially, that's what it runs into. If you take a third, then you're getting into the zone where you're probably going to have more hand tremor and less measurable benefits. Essentially, no additional benefit from that. Caffeine is something that is well documented to improve performance. Its status as a performance enhancing substance has actually changed. Like it's accepted by the WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, and the IOC. They used to test for caffeine. It used to be only permissible to a certain level, but they stopped because there's really no evidence that taking it beyond that level has any performance enhancing benefits. It's not like more is better, like, steroids, more is better. You get bigger, and that's not good. Don't take steroids,
Right.
kids. But,
Yeah.
but you do see more benefits the higher the dosage. Caffeine is not that case. There's that sweet spot about 400 milligrams essentially, for most average size people is going to be sort of the upper limit beyond which you're not going to see any measurable benefits for.
Right. So you've been in gyms for uh, decades.
Yes, yes, yeah.
So decades.
You like
Um,
literally 1987 was when I had my first gold gym membership way back. Yeah.
yeah, and so I have to ask because I'm more familiar, especially in, nutrition education, with talking to people about post workouts. So how long, like in your experience, have pre-workouts been a thing? Like, because really to me, I feel like this is kind of like a newer thing. I mean, there's TikToks about pre-workouts.
Yeah, and that's
So
something I'm old enough that I didn't know that till you told me. Yeah, and I learned. Oh man, there's so many TikToks. God, actually, I had my students telling me about some TikTok thing where people are basically causing shortages of diabetes medicine because of they're taking it for, well, yeah, non-diabetics are
weight
taking it for
weight
weight
loss.
loss, and
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
and they're it's this thing that they're sharing on TikTok. So
yeah.
yeah, but my personal read on it is probably early 2000s is when I first started hearing a lot about pre-workouts. That was, and that probably not coincidentally was when I became a college professor. So in the 80s, I didn't really hear much. Again, that's Ultimate Orange was there. People were taking, protein powders and amino acids, stuff like that. But pre-workouts, I think probably like late 90s, early 2000s when it probably started to really explode. Ultimate Orange was out there in the 80s, but it was kind of a unique product. And that was, yeah, probably early 2000s would be my best guess. I'd have to look when the market really started to take off, but it has taken off. And, there are so many things out there now, more than I could name, more than anybody reasonably could name. And tomorrow there will be more because more are going to enter the market. And they're constantly discovering, new things to put in them. Beetroot juice to try to give you a pump instead of arginine used to be the old thing. Bitter orange is a stimulant because supposedly it's going to be easier on your heart than caffeine. So they do try to constantly tweak them, which that's just the nature of the commerce essentially. The market is fast paced. New products are hitting it all the time. Um, and I guess with one of the things I wanted to touch on is that since we are talking about dietary supplements and we do live in the US, we're talking about it's kind of the Wild West in terms of minimal regulation and products can hit the market. They can have questionable, they don't have to have efficacy data, meaning they don't have to show that they work. They don't have to have safety data. They don't have to show that they're unsafe. They have to basically, people have to, so third parties have to show that they're unsafe. And that's essentially we have the FDA overwhelmed by the amount of stuff and the speed at which it hits the market. So there is a little bit of buyer beware with any dietary supplement, and pre-workouts are certainly, in that group. And, as we've talked about, there are sadly, fatalities linked with pre-workout use. And I would say typically that's not the fault of the, well, I should say typically that's not associated with what is recommended dosage on the package, but not always. To give you a good example, we're talking about caffeine, how, it's effective. It's generally safe if you consume it at the recommended dose. But one of the research studies that I cited in my article, they were actually doing quality analysis, which was really fascinating, on pre-workouts that were on the market. And what they found is see, I brought the number down there. Yeah, 266% variation in the caffeine content within batches of the same pre-workout. So that means whatever it says on the label, it could have basically 2.5 times that in the next dose that you take, which is really easily setting you up to potentially overdose on the substance. And yeah, that's a major quality control issue. And probably pretty common across the spectrum when you're talking about dietary supplements, because we do have sort of that lax regulation. The other issue is pre-workouts typically will have what's called a proprietary blend listed on the label when they talk about their ingredients. And that is a way in which they're legally able to not disclose the amounts of whatever substance it contains. They mix, has caffeine, citrus aurantium, and beetroot in a proprietary blend that we call, max jack you up stuff, or whatever their name they're going to give to it, but they don't actually have to disclose the amount of caffeine in it, which, that makes the potential for overdosing that much higher. So that's unfortunate. So they are effective in some studies, again, but are they doing more than a regular old cup of coffee? Because regular old cup of coffee or 2 cups is going to have a measurable effect as well. And what's in it. If you're not a coffee drinker, you can, there's other ways you can get your caffeine, but I would opt for stuff that's pretty clear cut, in my personal opinion.
Well, yeah, I mean, that would be a really good question. So if you're not a coffee drinker, or let's say, caffeine irritates your stomach, what would be an option? If you're going to the gym and everybody's taking a pre-workout, you might have a bit of FOMO there, if you're missing out. So, you
Sure.
know, do
That
you
is
do
a
you
good
need
question.
it? Do you need it? What?
You don't. And that's
Yeah.
the thing is, the thing that really I would encourage, one, I try to generally, without being too preachy, because I don't want to dictate your life, do what you want, but I personally would not advise anybody to take pre-workouts. People are still going to. A lot of times, it's tends to be more younger men who are really kind of into it, because there's kind of like a macho thing to it, I believe. And that kind of leads to you probably that very real FOMO where, you know, my bro's taking a pre-workout, I'll take it. And, that can probably lead to a lot of, risky behaviors. We see that a lot when kind of young men congregate. They tend to encourage each other to do silly things, sadly. But, pre-workouts, if you're going to take anything, what I would recommend, one, there are ways in which the supplement industry is self-regulated. So they do have labeling that ensures essentially a higher level of quality control. NSF and what's the other one? Let's see, is it? I hate my middle-aged brain. NSF is one of the labels. I think it's is it UP or whatever? But anyway, they're supplement industry self-regulation labels where they guarantee that there are no banned substances. They
USP.
guarantee UFC. I was close.
USP. Yep.
USP. Okay, yeah. UFC's Ultimate Fighting Championship. I should know that. But USP or NSF labeling, which is done by supplement companies, is a way in which they self-regulate, and essentially that they're ensuring that their products do contain what they're advertising, and they are also not containing any banned substances. Because there are instances of supplements being spiked with illicit materials, things that could actually cause one to test positive on a drug test, for instance. I know one study or one instance, it was a boxer who got busted for clenbuterol, which is an asthma medication and a stimulant and a banned substance, but he did not ingest it on purpose. He ingested it in a supplement that had been advertised as being free of banned substances. He actually got his suspension overturned, which was cool because it really did seem like a legitimate case of inadvertent ingestion. But when you're talking about athletes in tested federations, that's a pretty high stakes gamble that you're taking. But the labeling, the NSF specifically, I believe, is for athletes competing in tested federations. But that is something that you would definitely want to go by. So you should have a safer route with that. There are caffeine-free, pre-workouts or low-dose caffeine ones as well. So you can look for those on the label because there are, the industry is so big, they try to cater to all clienteles. They have caffeine-free versions of whatever, and they try to make it up with, sugar and B vitamins, give you energy that way.
Absolutely. Well, I would love to, just touch on some of the things that you've learned, kind of some takeaways about pre-workouts.
My main takeaway, I guess, would be, the evidence that they are effective is there, but it's a minor effect. It's a measurable effect, but it's a minor effect. And a large portion of that is probably, there's actually several studies. I've been lucky enough to be a co-author on one that really kind of showed that it probably is a lot to do with if you believe it's going to help, it will help. So
Gotcha.
you could have a lucky rabbit's foot, you could have a pet rock, you could have your lucky T-shirt. I had one of the athletes, the best athlete I ever coached in weightlifting. He made two world teams, but he had his lucky T-shirt that he would wear every warm up. And it was funny because he wore that thing. It was the wrestler Goldberg, his T-shirt. He wore that when he weighed 180 pounds when he was first started weightlifting, and he was still wearing it when he weighed 100 pounds more. He had cut out the sleeves, cut out the sides, so it was more like an apron at that point. But he was still wearing it to warm up because it was his lucky T-shirt, and he had that belief, and he performed well. He made two world teams. He medaled at the national championships. He did a lot of stuff with that. It helped him. Was it the fact that he's wearing a T-shirt helping him? No, but the fact that he, was thinking that it helped him, helped him. The power of belief is huge. If you believe that pre-workout's going to help you, they will help you. And that's, so on the opposite side, do you need a pre-workout? If you know you don't need a pre-workout, you can find other avenues to get that mental charge probably. I personally, if I was feeling very sluggish, I would look for caffeine from some other route that's just caffeine as a pick-me-up. I've seen studies where they've measured caffeine alone versus a multi-ingredient workout containing caffeine, and caffeine only did better, which is kind of interesting. So, if there's anything, if you're going to have any performance-enhancing benefits from pre-workouts, essentially it's the sugar and it's the caffeine. Sugar works. It's an energy source. Again, yet another like 50 plus years of solid research to showing that administration of sugar can enhance exercise performance. That's something I really didn't touch on yet. So sugar works, and so does caffeine. Caffeine works. So you put caffeine and sugar together, woo! You're really cooking. Coca-Cola and like Mountain Dew probably wouldn't be good choices because the carbonation probably wouldn't, it's going to slow gastric emptying, and it's going to probably make you more likely to feel a little bit bloated and farty and, not comfortable. But I don't know, flat Coke would probably be okay.
Oh
Don't know if you'd want to
gosh.
drink it, but if you just hate coffee, maybe that's an option. I'm reaching here. And they do. I'm sure there's some like non-carbonated caffeine and sugar containing soft drink. There's got to be, right? I can't think of one, but
Yeah, actually, I do think that they do make those. I can't think of the brand off the top of my head either, but um, yeah, I was thinking more of like the avenue of, um, sometimes the over ingestion of caffeine can actually, affect your sleeping patterns too, and that can affect your kind of sluggishness in the morning, if that's when you actually work out. So,
Yeah, and as usual, that's very sensible advice. Yeah, that's the point. Again, I think because it is so ubiquitous, it's everywhere. Caffeine is kind of ignored as having really the effects that it has, but it's actually a pretty potent stimulant. It it's an adenosine receptor antagonist, so it acts on your brain, essentially prevents you from feeling tired. Because like a buildup of adenosine, essentially in receptors in your brain, is what helps. Is one of the main mechanisms through which you get sleepy, and it has a half life. Caffeine does of 6 hours or so. So really, if you want to go to bed at 10 o'clock and you're taking a good dose of caffeine for your post workday workout that you're doing at 7 o'clock, that's going to be a major challenge for you. And adequate sleep is incredibly helpful for performance. It helps with everything. It helps you think better, helps you move better, it helps you build muscle mass better. That's a good rationale for maybe avoiding the caffeine later in the evening.
yes, absolutely. Well, this has been super informative.
Well, I've had a blast. Thank you for having me on. If we have any questions in the audience, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I would love to open this up to the audience if you have any questions or comments. Um, would love to have them. And, you know, I I would like to just ask, when it comes to pre and post workout drinks, pre workouts are to kind of jazz you up and get you ready, and then post workout drinks are for recovery then.
Exactly. Yeah, post workout's all about refueling. So the major ingredients are going to have carbohydrates and proteins in them in some fashion. So there's actually quite a few studies. The cheapest, and if you can handle lactose, the best is good old chocolate milk, because it's milk which has good quality proteins in it, casein and whey, and added sugar for that extra sweetness and the delicious chocolate flavor that we all enjoyed probably in elementary school. But there are a host of good studies that show that drinking chocolate milk after your workouts does help you recover better. It helps you restore the glycogen energy in your muscles and even build muscle mass over the long term. So it's a good, cheap route to go. And, there are lactose free versions of milk if you're one who's intolerant of lactose, as am I. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And you actually, on your profile page on the Food Guide site, have some really good options for people with GERD and, IBS for protein supplements, who can't have chocolates and all of that stuff. So, if anybody down in the audience or anybody listening in the future, suffers from IBS or GERD and, are looking for some protein supplements or protein treats, visit Food Guides and check out Alex's profile page. So he's got a food guide on there with some great options.
Oh,
So
thank you for the
fantastic.
plug.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again for talking all about pre-workouts with us. It's been
My
super cool.
privilege. Love being here.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you all for joining us. And we will see you next week for, I think we're making lentil garbanzo mushroom patties.
Sounds good.
Yes, it should be good on a bed of fresh spinach.
Interesting.
Yeah, awesome.
I'll get to taste
Well,
test. Yum.
yes, absolutely. Well, good night, everybody. Thank you.